I don't know how many of you remember, but it was back in November 5th of 1994 that former President Ronald Reagan wrote us a letter from his home near Santa Barbara. And in that letter, he acknowledged that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And instead of feigning strength, the former president was very honest and quite vulnerable. In his weakness, he reached out to you and me as fellow citizens. Let me just quote a couple of lines from that letter. He wrote, "My fellow Americans, I have recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. In the past, Nancy suffered from breast cancer and I had my cancer surgeries. We found through open disclosures we were able to raise public awareness. At the moment, I feel fine. I will continue to share my life's journey with my beloved Nancy and family. Unfortunately, as Alzheimer's disease progresses, the family often bears a heavy burden. I only wish that there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience. When the time comes, I am confident that with your help, she will face it with faith and courage. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." In that second reading today, Paul writes to the church at Corinth, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. For when I am weak, I am strong," Paul says. Power is made perfect in weakness. Certainly Reagan's letter, coming from one who was the most powerful person in the world, and then he was able to express such vulnerability, certainly a great model for us. He didn't try to mask the severity of his family's cross. He acknowledged it as perhaps Paul called it, the thorn in his side. Now, Paul admits to us that he begged the Lord to take the thorn out of his side, and we're not sure, scripture scholars are not sure exactly what that thorn was. But Paul was forced to enter into his weakness in order to discover his strength. He was forced to find God through working in this weakness, that he wasn't abandoned by God, but that God was present in God's way, not the way that Paul wanted him to be present. So Paul had to come to that awareness that God's grace was sufficient. Michael Newland is a staff archaeologist with the Anthropological Studies Center at Sonoma State University. His wife was 7 months pregnant when her blood pressure spiked. Her liver shut down, and so the doctors were forced to perform a cesarean, and their son was delivered to save both their lives. His wife got better, but their son died 2 weeks later. Michael found strength in this weakness, in this thorn in his side, and he wrote this: "I am a better husband, a better father, and a better man by my loss. I'm kinder, more empathic, and have different priorities. Our marriage was reforged, the impurities burned out of the relationship by the furnace of our son's death. To be with your child nearly every minute of his life is a gift few parents get, and my son died in the arms of people who loved him." Dr. Donald Rothenstein is the clinical director of the National Institute of Mental Health. He specializes in psychiatric care for the medically ill. His 16-year-old son, Kobe, has autism. He also is able to find strength in his weakness or his thorn. He writes this, "I believe that this lesson in adaptation has been one of Kobe's greatest gifts to me, to our whole family. I've seen it as Emma's embarrassment over her brother's condition has faded and been replaced with compassion for those who struggle. And I've seen the influence of Kobe's lesson in my own work, helping patients cope with illness and tragedy in their lives. Like my patient who can finally celebrate her father's memory after years of debilitating grief that came with every anniversary of his death. The playwright Eugene O'Neill had a great phrase, and the phrase is this. He said, "Man is broke, he lives by mending, and the grace of God is the glue." Well, we live in a culture where weakness and vulnerability are avoided at all cost. We define so often our power by our bank accounts, our titles, our prestige, our influence, how many people work for us. But as we know, that power is fleeting. We grow older. None of us escapes the loss of loved ones. Few of us escape some kind of chronic illness. Most of us experience disappointment and failure. Many parents give birth to children with all kinds of developmental or physical or psychological limitations. Because life is never fair. Life is always challenging, but life can also be amazingly joy-filled if we put it in the right perspective. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung tells us that we have to face our shadows, that dark side of ourselves. But I believe that we also have to face our vulnerabilities. I believe, like Paul, that all of us at some points in our lives have that thorn in our side. It's part of our humanness. We can work out 7 days a week. We can take all the vitamins possible. We can get plastic surgery on every part of our body, but we are still vulnerable to the challenges of life. And our titles and our bank accounts and our houses and our cars can't prevent life from impacting on us. And in the end, as Paul says, it comes down to grace, an acceptance of weakness, an ability to be patient and open to God's working in our lives, open to the blessings that can come to us from our weakness. Finding strength in our weakness, like that letter from Ronald Reagan, one of the most powerful leaders at one point, and now at that point, back in '94, accepting his vulnerability. The only survivor of a shipwreck was washed up on an uninhabited island, and he prayed feverishly for God to rescue him, and every day he scanned the horizon for help, but no rescue seemed to be forthcoming. He was exhausted, so eventually managed to build a little hut out of driftwood to protect him from all the elements and to store the few possessions that he had left. But one day, after scavenging after food, he arrived at home to find that his little hut was in flames, and the smoke was simply rolling up to the sky. The worst had happened. Everything was lost. He was stunned with grief and anger, and of course, like we would, he shouted at God, "God, how could you do this to me?" Early the next day, however, he awakened by the sound of a ship. The ship was approaching the island, and they had come to rescue him. And when they got on shore, he said to them, "Well, how did you know that I was here? How did you find me?" And they said, "We saw your smoke signal." It's so very easy for all of us, or any of us, to get discouraged by the challenges of life. Paul tells us not to lose heart. Paul tells us that God is at work in our lives, even in those thorns that we might have on our side, even in the midst of pain and suffering. So on this July 4th weekend, I think Paul calls us to remember the next time that our little hut is burning to the ground, It might simply be a smoke signal that summons the grace of God into our lives. Eugene O'Neill, I believe, was right. We're all broken. We all always need mending. And God's grace is the glue.